We all have some basic ideas about knowledge, truth, right and wrong, religion, and the nature and meaning of life. And we call these ideas philosophy. We commonly use the terms like the Eastern philosophy or Western philosophy or my personal philosophy or my institute's philosophy, right? So these are just certain basic ideas about life in general. And most of us have some ideas about what Eastern philosophy is or Western philosophy is, or we know what we are talking about. And lately, I've been studying about and contemplating on the vast field of Indian philosophy. And I'm totally fascinated by it. I find it super complex and profoundly simple at the same time. Hello, my name is Archana Mishra, and welcome back to Wellbeing Central. It's been a while since I shared the last episode on stress management, and I hope you found that useful. In this episode today, I'll share a very short summary of the entire Indian philosophy, and I hope to do justice to that, and I also hope that you find it as interesting as I do. And we can take it in further detail if you'd like, but today is just a primer, just a basic outline of what it means when we say Indian philosophy. So let's get started. Many of you may have heard of the ancient Indian scriptures called the Vedas, which literally means knowledge. These were the earliest known source of Indian knowledge system and are thought to have originated around 5,000 years ago. It could be even more ancient or more recent, we can't be sure, since the exact vintage of any ancient Indian scripture is debated due to many factors, be it political, tactical, practical, timing, and the way Indian philosophies emerged and developed over time. They can all mean that we don't have this conventional time frame for when something came into being and when they were practiced. So there are four Vedas: Rig Veda, Samaved, Yajurved, and Atharvaved. And they contain social, moral, spiritual, and ethical codes in general, we can say, basically, how to live a meaningful life. It is believed that the Vedic knowledge was revealed to various seers or rishis in their peak meditative state, and hence there is no specific author of any of these Vedas. However, a very wise man named Vedvyas is known to have compiled and classified all the Vedic knowledge into four main texts, as I mentioned: Rig, Sam, Yajur, and Atharva, depending on what they offer. Each Veda is then further divided into four parts: the Samhita or the hymns, Brahmana or the explanation of the rituals, Aranyaka. These are the internal observations or internal observances for those people who are living like hermits away in isolation, such as forest. And finally, the Upanishad. These are the philosophical teachings. These are also called Vedantas or the end of the Vedas. It is remarkable that something so ancient has been passed down to us, and a lot of people will argue that they have been passed down to us intact, and they are still being referred to during the rituals, many of our events, milestones in life, the processes, traditions. They all have the Vedic underpinnings a lot of times, and also for healing and chanting purposes, which is what I am doing right now. I'm learning to chant Vedic mantras and bring healing to myself, and hopefully into the future share that with others. So they have been saved and they have been passed on to us in their original form is mainly because the Vedic knowledge was orally transmitted from teachers to students, from one tradition to the next generation, following that same tradition over time. And it was saved from the risk of getting destroyed by enemies because it was all in our mind. We received that from our teachers and then we passed on to the students. And they were also saved from the natural wear and tear from just kind of being there or trying to preserve. They could have been, bookworms, or they could have been natural calamities that could destroy. So, because of the oral tradition, we still have them with us, or majority of them anyway. Okay, so that was Vedas in a nutshell. Now let's look at a quick summary of the Indian philosophy, which is the topic of the podcast today. So, to summarize, Indian philosophy is vast, diverse, and in multiple forms, but they all share the same goal. The shared goal here is simply how to maximize pleasure or joy and minimize suffering. Suffering is also called dukkha, which many of you may have heard, and pleasure is also understood in Sanskrit term as sukha. So it's very beautifully summed up in Sanskrit as the main idea or goal behind Indian philosophy is dukkha nivritti, sukha prapti. So the achievement of sukha and elimination of dukkha. So what is suffering or dukkha? The word dukkha is made of duk and kha. Kha means space and duk means restriction. So when we feel restricted in the heart space, that is dukkha. So suffering is not like a major calamity or a big loss or humongous pain, etc. Suffering is also any kind of restriction in our heart space because of difficulty, inconveniences, or many other forms of emotions or feelings or events that we are facing in our life could all be compiled as dukkha. Similarly, joy or sukha is the space that is good or expansive. So when we experience an expansive space in our heart, that is sukha. So think about it. When you are feeling constrained or restricted, it probably is because something is bothering you. And when you are feeling calm and content in your life or in that moment, that's when you feel this sense of pleasure. So before we understand how to eliminate suffering and how to maximize the pleasure, let's just learn about. So there is a common understanding about the sources of suffering among all the Indian philosophical texts that I'm going to talk about. And number one is adhyatmika, or self-inflicted physical or mental disturbances. And there are many sources for that. Then number two is adhibhautika, that which is caused by another being or objects like other people or animals, or physical structures that could create or inflict pain to us or suffering to us. And number three is adidaivika, or that which is beyond our control. We also call them in legal terms the acts of God, such as natural calamities or celestial events, something that we cannot control, that's not self-inflicted or that's not inflicted by other being, is Adidaivika. Even though the philosophies are different, this is the common understanding about self, other beings, and divine sources of suffering. So let's now come to the Indian philosophy itself. There are 9 branches of Indian philosophies. They are also called darshanas, which literally means to see or reflect. 6 of these darshanas consider Vedas as their authority, and that's why they are also called Vaidika Darshana, and 3 of them reject Vedas as their authority, and that's why they are called Avadika Darshanas or non-Vedic Darshanas. The term Astik and Nastikas also come from this acceptance or rejection of Veda as the authority. So the philosophies that accept Vedas are called Astikas, and those that reject them are called Nastikas. However, for some reason, these terms are now being respectively used for people based on whether they believe in God or no. That was not the original intent, because as you'll see, not all Indian philosophies embrace the notion of God as the ultimate source of the universe. Okay, so now let's start with the 6 Vaidika Darshanas. First one is Nyaya. This philosophy is contained in the text called Nyaya Sutra and was written by Gautama. And it calls for understanding the reality through logic alone, understanding the causes and effects of something that happens through reasoning and debates. Once we understand the cause for something that's happening to us, we will be able to understand and eliminate our suffering. So, the Nyaya Sutra very clearly says that only when we understand the reason for our suffering, we are able to eliminate it. So, focus on applying logic and debate, which is called tarka, to figure out the main reason for suffering and eliminate. And when we eliminate our suffering, we enhance our joy. That is the logic behind Nyaya Sutra. Now, the second is Vaisheshika. And interestingly, Vaisheshika shares many concepts with the Nyaya philosophy, and it breaks down everything to the atomic level. Founded by sage Kannada, Vaisheshika Sutra describes the universe as composed of eternal atoms of earth, water, fire, and air that combine to form all physical objects, with souls undergoing cycles of rebirth determined by karma and the will of God. So, Vaisheshika is essentially a natural philosophy that provides a metaphysical framework for understanding what exists, and essentially notes that when we start understanding everything as simply a combination of atoms, we feel no suffering. And it does make sense, right? Like if we start looking at everything and keep going down to its subatomic level, then, and if we understand everything as atoms, then we don't feel as much suffering as we would when we understand things in a different way. So, Nyaya and Vaisheshika are complementary philosophies. However, interestingly, Nyaya doesn't embrace divine as a substratum, but Vaisheshika considers the role of divine as important. Now, let's move on to the third philosophy. It's called Sankhya. It's actually one of my favorite philosophies. So, Sankhya Sutra by Kapila was the original text that shows us how reality is essentially an evolution of Prakriti or the primordial matter, and it consists of 24 tattvas or principles. So this evolution becomes possible due to the presence of Purusha or pure consciousness. That is the main essence of Sankhya philosophy. While the original text of Sankhya Sutra was destroyed, we can study these principles through the Sankhya Karika of Ishvara Krishna. According to Sankhya, reality is composed of two eternal principles, Purusha, pure consciousness, and Prakriti, material nature, or the source of the world that we see. They are both real, but Purusha is not subject to change, but Prakriti changes, and the world manifests as a result of its evolution. The goal of Sankhya is to eliminate suffering by realizing the fundamental distinction between Purusha and Prakriti, which leads to self-knowledge, and it ends the cycle of birth, life, and death. This philosophy doesn't embrace God or any divine power and is complementary to the yoga philosophy that I'm going to tell you next. So both yoga and Sankhya are dualistic philosophies, meaning they consider the consciousness and matter as two distinctive realities. Now, so let's look at yoga. This is the fourth Vaidika Darshana. Yoga is the science of the mind. That's pretty much its domain. That's where it operates. And it borrows the essential concepts of Purusha, the consciousness, and Prakriti, matter, in this case, body, mind, and senses complex. And yoga also considers these two entities as separate. In fact, the whole suffering, the entire suffering happens because we don't understand this separation between consciousness and matter, according to yoga and Sankhya. So, according to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, we can eliminate suffering by refining our mind to understand that separation and by surrendering to Ishvara, God, or the divine, whatever you may call it. This surrendering means doing things to the best of our abilities. So, taking action, doing our duties, doing everything that we can possibly within our capacity and our ability, but then not be attached to a particular outcome. We should be able to have the ability to accept the result, whatever that may be. And this development of the ability also comes with the practice of yoga, which is essentially, as I said, is the refining of our mind. Now, here again, we see that while Sankhya doesn't embrace the divine, yoga does. And yet, they are known as the sister philosophies. I find this really, truly fascinating. Coming to the fifth philosophy, it's called the Purva Mimamsa. This philosophy is contained in the Purva Mimamsa Sutra by Jaimini and follows the Karma Kanda of Vedas. So Veda has different aspects, as I told you. So one is the Karma Kanda, or the ritual parts. This philosophy promotes the performance of Vedic rituals as a way of accumulating punya or good karmas and attaining the heaven or swarga. If not, we will accumulate papa or bad karma and experience hell or naraka. In other words, our suffering could be eliminated if we perform the Vedic rituals in their right way with the right intention. Now let's come to the sixth Vedika philosophy, which is called the Uttara Mimamsa, or also Vedanta. Vedanta literally means the end of the Veda. This philosophy is contained in the Brahma Sutra or Vedanta Sutra by Vyasa. Other sources of Vedantas are the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. Vedanta focuses on the Atma, or the soul, which is very different from yoga. Yoga just focuses mainly on the refinement of the mind. What happens to us while we are still alive, while we still have the mind, is the domain of yoga. And what happens afterwards, what happens after death, what happens to the Atma, or what is the journey of the soul before the birth, during the birth, and after the birth, is the concern of the Vedantas. And also the Brahman, the ultimate source, is also very much a major central theme of Vedanta. Vedanta is a non-dualistic philosophy, unlike Sankhya and Yoga. According to Vedanta, there is only Brahman, the ultimate source, and nothing else. Our mind thinks everything is real, but it's simply illusion or Maya. Therefore, we can eliminate suffering and maximize joy by understanding the true nature of the Brahman and by not engaging or being attached to the illusion or Maya. Okay, so these were the 6 Vedic darshanas. Now let's look at the 3 non-Vedic darshanas. They are equally as fascinating. So they do not consider Vedas as their authority. They reject Vedas. That's their premise. Okay, so let's go to the first one is Buddhism. Buddhism's core beliefs center around the 4 noble truths and the 8-fold path to end suffering and achieve nirvana, or the eternal bliss. Life is seen as a cycle of suffering and rebirth, driven by craving and desire. So as long as we are craving and having desire, we keep coming back, keep taking birth, keep going through this cycle. So the Buddhists follow a moral code, including the 5 precepts, and practice meditation, wisdom, and compassion to live a balanced middle way between extremes. So the middle way is the core of Buddhism. They venerate the historical Buddha, or the Siddhartha Gautam, as a moral teacher rather than a god, and follow his teachings, which is also called dharma, within a community of believers or sangha. So Buddha, dharma, sangha are their tenets, are their substratums, and they don't consider God as the authority here. Coming to the second one of the Avedika Darshana, it's Jainism. So Jainism is focused on non-violence. That's their main concern. Believing all living beings have souls that are reborn in a cycle of death and rebirth until liberation is achieved. Liberation here is that eternal bliss or nirvana. And how do we achieve liberation? Is by cleansing the soul of our karmas. And then the key principles here include the 3 jewels: right faith, right knowledge, and right conduct. And the 5 vows or Mahavratas: non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, sexual restraint, and non-attachment to possessions. Well, interestingly, these Mahavratas are also very similar to what Patanjali's Yoga Sutra promotes. The Jains practice strict vegetarianism, avoid harming any living being, and aim to understand the universe through multiple viewpoints. Now, coming to the final one, that's called Charvaka. So, Charvaka literally means sweet-tongued. And Charvaka is a materialistic and atheistic philosophy centered on the idea that only what is perceived through the senses is real and valid knowledge. So they reject the concepts like soul, karma, afterlife, and religious liberation. That's their uh, not something they believe in. They assert that the pursuit of pleasure and the fulfillment of sensory desires are the sole aims and highest good of life. Charvakas view religion as a tool for exploitation and believe that pain, not sin, is evil. So, therefore, they promote a hedonistic, individualistic, and pragmatic approach to live in this world. You have come to this world, enjoy to its maximum, enjoy all material things, enjoy all sensory pleasures, and just the end will come and you go. There's nothing before or after. So you see how diverse Indian philosophy is. What I love the most is the coexistence and acceptance of seemingly opposite perspectives. There is room for believing in the presence or absence of divine. There is room for pursuing spiritual or material goals. And you can live a life with moral or pragmatic code. These are simply different ways in which we understand and experience reality, and none are considered greater or lesser than the other. I think such a level of respect for different perspectives is incredible and much needed in today's world of division, where people have so much bias and hatred for those who don't think and believe in the same principles as they do. What do you think? And I mean, the basic goal is the same. We are all trying to eliminate our suffering and maximize our joy. These are just different doors to the same room. So why so much hate? Why so much disturbances in our mind when we meet people who don't think like us, who don't practice like us, who don't worship the same God like us? I mean, that's why I keep coming back to the ancient Indian thought system, the Indian philosophies. They are as progressive, as open, as embracing, as inclusive as they can ever be. So, what are your thoughts about these perspectives? Have you explored any of these beliefs? And did you learn anything surprising or worth thinking about in this podcast? If you have taken even one single thought out of this podcast, I'll be very happy. And if not, well, send me your feedback and I'll try to improve. What I presented here is just a very brief outline of a vast field of Indian philosophy. But if you want to learn more about this topic, just send me a message and I'll do research on that particular topic and do a podcast for you. I thank you all for listening to this episode, and I hope to reconnect with you soon with something interesting again. Until then, be well, and let's take one more step closer to Well-Being Central. Thank you.